In academia, we normally focus on what are scholarly sources, but in the law, we mainly focus on what are primary and secondary sources. So if you're using this LibGuide and you're not a lawyer and you're not a law student, you may be unfamiliar with these terms. And because this LibGuide focuses on immigration law, I wanted to touch on this in this video. Your primary sources consist of your statutes and codes, your regulations, treaties or international agreement, and case law. Now, the difference between statutes and regulations is that regulations are interpretations of statutes by administrative agencies. Now, your primary sources can either be binding and mandatory or persuasive. A primary source is binding on the court if it comes from the jurisdiction where the court sits. So in the case of immigration law, the immigration courts are bound by the primary sources of immigration statutes, regulations, treaties, and precedent case law, which are mentioned in this LibGuide. The primary sources are persuasive if it comes from a jurisdiction other than the one where the court sits. There can sometimes be a hierarchy on persuasive sources depending on the facts of the case and the demographics of the jurisdiction where the source comes from. So, for example, a Kansas Supreme Court case may be more persuasive to a Missouri court than a California Supreme Court case because Kansas is closer in proximity to Missouri, but also because the demographic of the population is more similar than California would be. Everything else is a secondary source. Some of the more common secondary sources include practice manuals, treatises, not to be confused with treaties, law reviews and journals, and legal encyclopedias. All secondary sources are persuasive and non-binding because they are not laws. That means they're also not often cited in legal proceedings because of their secondary nature. But that doesn't mean that they aren't useful. Secondary sources are very useful for legal research and education purposes. Many people, lawyers included, begin researching a specific legal issue with a secondary source to narrow down the primary sources they need to search. It cuts down on searching very complicated statutes and extensive case law histories. They're also more typically easier to read and understand than the complicated statutes. I hope you've learned a little bit about primary and secondary sources in this video and it helps you with your use of this LibGuide.